series here. He needs absolutely no introduction. But if anybody needs one, he was the original COO of PayPal, so most definitely part of the infamous PayPal Mafia group. Had his own company, Yammer, that was extremely successful. Ended up helping Zenefits pretty significantly and serving as its interim CEO for a long time. A big friend of entrepreneurs. He's had many, many exciting investments along the way and along his journey. In fact, I would say he's probably one of the best angel investors of our time. And now has started his own fund called Craft Ventures. Is that a fun fact? Like, what do you do for fun? Oh, he's South African, for the South Africans in this room.
Okay.
Anything else that I can share that other people wouldn't usually know about you?
I don't, I like poker and chess, sort of like games like that.
Great, he likes poker and chess, and you should most definitely come and play poker and chess with us one of these days. Trisha is a member of our community, also had previous experience working at a firm, started her own company. Usually, I like to tap into our community to moderate these Q&As. They're usually more insightful and well thought of than if I did them myself. So thank you, Trisha, for offering to do this. And just a quick reminder for those of you who don't know what South Park Commons is, we are a community of technologists that like experimenting, tinkering, figuring out what we want to work on next. Here in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of pressure to focus on what's next instead of taking the time and being thoughtful about it, thinking of things that might be provocative, thinking of things that might be interesting out in the future. And that's the kind of support system that we do provide. So there's never any right or wrong, only the desire to experiment and push the boundaries here. So if you're in between things and looking for a community, definitely stop by and join us.
Thanks for the introduction, Ruchi, and we're glad to have you here. David doesn't do too many speaking engagements, so we're very lucky. So to start off, why did you decide to join PayPal, and how did you even hear about it?
Yeah, let's see. I had good to be with everyone here today. Thanks for having me. I knew Peter from college. We'd gone to Stanford together, and I thought I missed the whole internet thing. This was already in late '99, and I saw all this excitement happening from Silicon Valley, and I thought, oh, it's too bad. Like Amazon, eBay. I thought it's too bad I missed that. I might have felt like something maybe I'd be good at. And then I got a call from Peter, and he was doing the startup. It's called Confinity back then, and he convinced me to join.
So, but it was a very different company than what it did become. What was it then?
Yeah, so at the time it was this Palm beaming product. The idea was that you would beam money from one Palm Pilot to another. I don't know if anyone here remembers. The Palm Pilot was kind of it was like before BlackBerry. It was, before iPhone, before BlackBerry, it was Palm Pilot. And like one of its big novelties was that there was this IR port on it where you could like beam various things, and they would open that up to applications. And so like you could beam a business card, for instance. So the original idea of the company was to let you beam money, and more technically kind of an encrypted payment certificate. I started having a discussion with Peter in the summer of '99 about this, and I thought it was kind of a really dumb idea. It was, who'd ever want to do this? Like, who would ever want to use this thing? And no one could really come up with a better use case than two people having dinner. Of course, they'd both have to have a Palm Pilot, and they would need to split the bill, and they'd want to whip out their Palm Pilots and beam the money. Anyway, but in the course of having that conversation, we talked about, well, what if you could just email the money? Then you wouldn't need to have a Palm Pilot. There were at the time about 250 million email users. There were only about 5 million Palm users, and so it seemed like a 50 times better idea, just based on those numbers. And I told Peter, well, if that's what the idea is going to be, I'd quit my job tomorrow and I'll come join you. And so that's what ended up happening.
So how did PayPal pivot to what it did eventually become?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a case of, so while they were working on the Palm beaming product, the question did come up, well, what if the other person didn't have a Palm Pilot with them? And I think it was Max or somebody came with this, said, well, let's build a little feature into the Palm app that lets you just put in someone's email address, and then when you just basically put in their email and a dollar amount, basically some money fall on PayPal. And when you get back to your computer, what would happen is you would sync the Palm Pilot. You put it on a cradle. That's how like the Palm Pilot worked back then. It wasn't really internet connected. It would connect to your computer, and there'd be like a batch process. Anyway, so when you got back to your computer, you'd sync it, and then the payment would go through. And I think that sparked this edge case that eventually ate the whole product, because the idea was, wait a second, if you can actually just email somebody, why do we need the Palm Pilot? Why do we need the cradle? Why do we need anything else? And so that kind of got, so the pivot kind of grew out of that kind of edge case.
Did you see the edge case accelerating at a faster rate than the original case?
I just thought that, yeah, I mean, so emailing money was an idea that I could get like really excited about. And, you know, I think part of it was just there weren't that many Palm Pilot users, and it just seemed like a much more kind of killer idea. You know, the idea of being able to email anybody money anywhere, anytime through the internet, that just seemed like kind of obviously a much better idea than this kind of niche beaming thing. And so, yeah, I mean, it seemed kind of obvious to me that this was the right sort of direction.
How did they happen upon that? Was there something in the early discussions that, okay, let's try this and give this a shot? Or what do you think was there about the culture early on where it was that Palm Pilots wouldn't be the only thing in the company?
You know, I think it was just a matter of like stumbling onto the idea and then realizing that that idea was better than the one that you started with. I mean, I think it was really that simple. And you know, like I mentioned, there were 250 million emails, so 50 times more email users than Palm Pilots. And so, you know, we all came at it in different ways. I think Peter came at it sort of mathematically. Well, there's a lot more email users. I kind of came at it from a kind of user psychology, which is like, why would anyone want to do this? You know, and emailing money was kind of easier to see that behavior taking off than a beaming thing. So everyone kind of came at it from a different perspective, I think.
So in terms of the PayPal Mafia, there are a lot of other very successful companies, Google, Netflix, Amazon. None of them were able to produce that equivalent of a Mafia that PayPal did. Was there something about the people, the culture early on, or the problems that the company faced that led it to do that?
Yeah, I think it was a bunch, all those things. So I think there was something about the people. You know, they were not recruited by headhunters or anything like that. They generally were recruited through a friendship network. So, you know, I knew Peter from college, he recruited me, I then recruited my friends and so on down the line. Max, same thing with his friends from U of I. And so as a result, the people tended to be cut more from the same cloth, which is that you had a lot of founder personalities, you know, kind of throughout the organization. That was, I think, part of it. I think, you know, another part of it was timing. You know, that PayPal was one of the only successful companies to kind of survive that through the dot-com crash. And then, you know, we had a successful exit in 2002. And so while everyone was, at that point, everyone was like leaving the valley. You know, there's an old joke that B2B was back to banking and B2C was back to consulting. Everyone was kind of like leaving. You had all these people from PayPal who had actually had the opposite experience. It was like, you know, it worked for us. And then of course, you know, eBay was kind of getting rid of all these people, you know, or not really making room for them. And so they all kind of left. I mean, I've called it's more of a diaspora than a mafia, in the sense that eBay kind of, you know, they had a very different culture. It was much more corporate. And so, you know, all the PayPal folks kind of, you know, they burned down our temple and we basically had to flee. So, I mean, and so you got like all of a sudden these people fanning out in Silicon Valley at a time when like everyone else was kind of depressed and leaving. And I think, so it's all those types of things. And then of course, you know, I think the people actually learned a lot from the whole PayPal experience, and they were able to take that playbook with them to all these new companies.
So you've written a lot about fostering dissent, and some of the other people in the PayPal Mafia also talked a lot about it. Can you talk more about it? What do you think is the importance of fostering dissent early on?
Yeah, so I mean, I just think all human communities have the problem of like conflict and disagreement. And so the question is kind of how you manage that. And you know, if you walk into a company and everyone seems to agree about everything, that's actually not harmony. It's, I'd say, symptomatic of more of a totalitarian culture where no one feels free to speak their mind. And so in thinking about the Yammer culture, when I was founding that company, I wanted a culture where people could be free to disagree and you could have dissent in the hopes of finding the best idea. You didn't want them to feel like they couldn't, speak their mind. And then of course, but you also want it to be harmonious enough to function as a company. And that was the balance we tried to strike at Yammer. And it helped that the product was like, social networking product. I mean, everyone in the company was on it all the time. And so everyone was kind of free to say whatever they wanted. And so we the product kind of enabled the culture that we were going for.
But when you're growing big companies, and PayPal was 500 people, you managed 500 people. And when you're fostering dissent, then how do you manage that dissent? People become more protective and territorial of what they're working on. So how do you manage that and make it easier to dissent?
Well, the goal is for anyone in the company who has useful information or a point of view to be able to communicate it. And what you don't want is, let's say you've got people in customer support who are dealing with customers all day and they're hearing problems with the product. They're creating tickets. They know where the bugs are. They know where the usability issues are. You want them surfacing that information. And you want the product manager who's in charge of that product to not react defensively. You want them to, you don't want them to say, hey, you're the customer support person. What right do you have to tell me like I should be doing my job? That's a very, that's sort of, that type of reaction, I think, would be, it's not what you want, obviously. It's, there's something kind of, toxic about that. And so you want everyone in the company to feel free to bring forth the information that's going to help everyone do their jobs. And, people can't be defensive about that.
How do you hire for people? Or when you interview people, how do you know that they won't be defensive?
A lot of this is sort of culture that's set at the beginning from the founders. I think company culture is, it's something that's very hard to articulate exactly what it is. I think it's more like behavioral norms that get set early on and then get kind of imitated by people. So, I think in my own case, when I was a CEO, one of the things I thought about a lot was making sure I didn't create like a bubble around myself where it was just kind of people tell me what I wanted to hear all the time. And, so what I would do is just kind of like always ask my reports or really anybody I met with in the company what they thought about an issue. And I would let them, if they didn't agree with the strategy, I wanted to know that. I sought to draw out those disagreements, that information. And I was kind of constantly inspecting whether the strategy of the company was correct.
So with respect to culture, at Zenefits, what do you think happened and how did you bring about the change in that culture which wasn't perhaps set in the correct tempo in the beginning?
I'd sort of like up level a little bit because I don't want to pick on Zenefits too much. I feel like I've kind of already spoken a lot about it. I would just say that I think that with some of these high growth companies, you have to be careful. Growth is very important, but you have to be careful not to let things go off the rails. And, particularly when you're working in kind of a highly regulated environment, you have to be, I think, more sensitive to regulatory issues like earlier on in a company's life. And, you've got to set the cultural tone around that.
Okay, we'll take two questions from the audience at this point, if there are any.
So you mentioned kind of sensitivity to regulatory issues. Can you speak a little bit about kind of how you navigated that in the early days of PayPal, where there's this delicate balance of flying under the radar because you're too small to be regulated, but at the same time you very quickly become a large player and have to deal with a very antiquated financial regulatory system?
Yeah, so at PayPal, I would say, didn't have too much of a problem complying with the rules. I think there was like a moment where we realized that we might need to get money transmitter licenses. I think when we started off, we didn't realize that we needed it. At some point, we got a really good lawyer, and he said, "Yeah, you need this," and then we raced around and got them. So there was, some catching up as we learned things, but once we kind of learned what we were supposed to do, we didn't have any problem sort of meeting the requirements and complying. And certainly there was no question on our part that we needed to do that. I think some of the trickier issues were navigating around. There were like a lot of Visa, MasterCard rules at that time about sort of online payments. And it was really a gray area that we were operating in. And I think this can come up a lot with startups where there are some rules, but the rules either are antiquated or were never meant to anticipate like the type of thing you're doing. And so you're operating in a gray area. And what I would say is when the rules are black and white, you better just, abide by the rules. If the rules are kind of in a gray area, I think it's okay to obviously have a presumption in favor of operating, but you should make the case for why what you're doing is in the consumer's interest or in the public interest. And so, if you look at kind of the issues that Uber or Airbnb got into, I think it's fine that Uber was operating, in this gray area of taxi regulations, but then just go out publicly and make the case for why this is in the public's interest. And Airbnb, same thing with hotel regulations. Here's what we're doing. It's new. We don't think hotel regulations really cover this, but here's why what we're doing is in the public interest. And I think you actually advocate for what you're doing. You don't try to kind of hide it or something like that. So that's what I'd recommend a startup tackle that is if what you're doing is clearly like against the black letter law, don't do it. If it's unclear, operate, but make the case, advocate for why what you're doing is a good thing.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that the recruitment process at PayPal, right, was basically through the network. Do you recommend that for like a new startup to recruit through friends or through a network instead of like a recruiter? And how did you get convinced to join PayPal? Like, what was the tipping point? Was it the team? Was it Peter Thiel? Because I imagine he was probably the same age as you or younger. Like, I don't know. Peter's
a few years older than me, but yeah, I mean, that's not too good if I'm looking older than Peter. But how did I decide to join? I mean, obviously knowing Peter, and Peter was maybe one of the smartest, if not the smartest person I've ever met. That was obviously, and then I flew out and met the team. And I remember also having a conversation with some of my other Stanford classmates who were still out here, like Kevin Hartz. He was very encouraging, saying, look, you should come back. There's it's still really exciting here. And actually, I was listening to a podcast with Keith Raboy, and he mentioned that Kevin Hartz convinced him to come back. I was like, oh yeah, actually he convinced me too. So Kevin was really useful in that regard. And then, once the idea kind of pivoted to this emailing money, I thought the idea was killer. So that was important in my thinking as well. In terms of, how should you think about recruiting for your startup? It's always great when you can do it with friends. You got a pre-existing relationship. Certainly the founding team, you want the founders to be friends, I think, and to know each other. You know each other's strengths and weaknesses. You have a relationship. And it's tough building these companies. So you can't really do it with somebody you don't know, I don't think. But obviously, it's beyond the founding team. It tends to be hard to just do it with your friends. You don't typically have enough friends to do it with, and so then you end up recruiting people and going down the traditional path.
Can I ask a follow-up question on the regulatory industry? So in the cases of Airbnb and Uber, neither of them, when they first started off, thought they were playing in a regulated market. That just happened over the course of time. But would you lean in or lean out as an investor when it comes to companies that are targeting a clearly regulated market, like the financial services industry or one of those other ones?
I think it can be a positive to go after those industries if because the regulatory compliance can become a moat if you do it right. So it wouldn't, as an investor, it wouldn't be necessarily a positive or a negative. It'd be about how the founding team is thinking about it. Do they understand the regulations? What's their strategy for compliance? Is it a gray area, or is it kind of allowed, or is it kind of clearly not allowed? Which bucket is it in? And if it's in the kind of gray area bucket, which it usually is, what's your plan for publicly advocating for what you're doing? And I think one of the lessons from Uber and Airbnb is they should have been advocating earlier that what they were doing was actually in the public interest, and and I think it might have been helpful.
Okay, cool. So let's continue to Yammer. So at Yammer, it was very interesting because you were selling to enterprises, some of them really big enterprises. What were the distribution tricks that you employed to be able to sell into them?
So the big thing that Yammer did that no one had really done before was take consumer virality and apply it to an enterprise product. And back, this was in 2008, so it's 10, 11 years ago, even the DNA of people who were doing consumer versus enterprise was very different. Like the enterprise companies tended to have people who had worked at like Oracle or maybe Salesforce or something like that. It wasn't people who are coming from social networking companies. And we try to break down that barrier a little bit. We decided to use consumer tactics to go after an enterprise business. And the specific thing we did was just let anybody in the company sign up and start spreading it to their coworkers. We would verify their company email address and then put them in a network, the same way that Facebook put people in their kind of college networks based on a .edu email address. We put people in their company networks based on their work email address. And so people could just start using it for free, and there was we didn't have to go sell it to the CIO of the company, which is how like all enterprise products at that point, required like sales first and to even get into the company. And we like this idea of just letting the employees themselves just use the product. And so our sales motion was very different. We would, our whole sort of top of funnel was viral. We didn't talk to any companies that weren't already using Yammer. We'd go to the CIO, we'd say, hey, you've got 1,000 employees already using Yammer. Do you want to control this? And so and it allowed us to grow much more quickly. It like massively reduced the friction of a traditional enterprise product.
So you deploy the same distribution trick for startups as well as really big companies?
Yeah, exactly. It was just, you would just sign up with your company email address. It didn't matter if you were an SMB or an enterprise, it would work the same way. And keep in mind, this is when the cloud was still pretty new. So one of the reasons why people weren't doing this yet is because most enterprises weren't even buying cloud yet. I mean, that was still a huge objection that we got during our sales processes. Is cloud safe? Or, okay, what you're doing looks kind of cool. Just give me a version that I can, install run on a server myself behind my firewall. And like we got that all the time. And it wasn't really about till I would say 2010, 2011 that cloud started becoming tipped from default scary, insecure to default okay, and now it's I'd say default positive. But because all the previous software was being run on-prem, spinning up new instances, you could never do a viral strategy. It didn't. The architecture didn't support it. Once you were totally cloud-based, multi-tenant, now the next step was to make it viral and freemium, and so that's what we did.
How did you happen upon this strategy, or how did you decide that this would definitely work and that you should employ this strategy versus just doing what most other companies were doing at the time?
Yeah, I mean, so the two things I really look for in a startup are a product hook and a distribution trick. So the product hook is kind of like a core user behavior that you can kind of build the product around. It's something that users are going to want to engage in repeatedly. So for PayPal, it was sending money. You just type an email address, a dollar amount, and you hit send. For Uber, it's putting a pin on a map and summoning a driver to pick you up. For Google, it's like the ultimate product hook. It's just you type in a search query. So I think the first thing I do is try to figure out what's the atomic unit of this product. What's the repeat behavior that I can get people to do it over and over again. The other thing I try to figure out is, again, what's my distribution trick? If I'm just doing the same things everyone else is going to do, it's going to take too long. It's going to be too slow. So backing up to Yammer, what I was doing at that time was I was actually doing a family social network called Genie. This was back in 2007. And I began to get really paranoid that Facebook was just going to eat the family social space, that it wouldn't be a separate thing than friends. And so I started thinking about, well, where else could we pivot to? And I started thinking about corporate. And a corporate social network would be a really cool idea. And we could even use this viral trick around, just going in, verifying people's email addresses, building company networks, for like 2 minutes, Facebook actually had a company network feature, but they actually got rid of it. Like we were kind of taking the crumbs off. This like $1 billion crumb they just kind of discarded. We kind of took that. But I still didn't know exactly what the product hook would be. And then Twitter came out and kind of introduced this idea of just posting like a status update. Like, what are you doing? And I'm like, oh, okay. Now what I can do is kind of use like a work update. Like, what are you working on as kind of a product hook? And obviously there's a lot of other functionality, and it kept getting more built out over time into something more robust, more like a social intranet. But I needed a hook to launch with. And so the idea that someone could just post a status update into their work feed, that was the original name of the product, was work feed before we changed it to Yammer. That kind of gave me the ingredients necessary to like launch the MVP.
Okay, so there was a big pivot in that.
The pivot was basically going from family social networking to sort of corporate social networking. We ended up selling Genie to a company called MyHeritage, which is in the family genealogy space a few years later. And then, Yammer went off to have a unicorn exit with Microsoft.
So with respect to distribution tricks, you had mentioned that they follow the law of distribution arbitrage,
Right.
which I think is a great way to put it because it is truly temporary. So
Right.
what have you seen companies do to keep finding new distribution tricks?
Yeah. So so let me, for everyone here, we talked about the law of distribution arbitrage. So the basic idea is that any distribution technique that works will be copied by people until it's no longer unusually effective. So like if you figure out a way to advertise through AdWords, well, eventually people will figure it out, copy you, and bid up those AdWords until it's no longer unusually effective. Or let's say that you figure out a way to kind of go viral through Facebook platform. Well, eventually everyone copies that, and now the whole feed gets spammed, and then Facebook shuts it off. These channels get burned out. Or spamming, one of the big techniques in social about 10 years ago was importing people's address books and then spamming the whole address book. Well, eventually users figured out they would just block you, or Gmail would just block you preemptively, or users just kind of stopped clicking on those links. They just kind of like got sick of the spam. And so the point is, these techniques will work for a while, but eventually like the channels get burned out because too many people are doing it. And so you've always got to figure out like some, I'd say, innovation or wrinkle on a distribution technique. So if you want to grow at some unusually fast rate, and the distribution trick doesn't have to last forever, but it needs to kind of give you a bootstrap for some period of time, maybe for the first year or two. At PayPal, we had like multiple distribution tricks. I mean, first of all, the product was viral. I could email you money without you having an account. But and then we did sign up and referral bonuses. We'd actually pay you $10 to sign up, and then if you referred a friend, we'd pay you another $10 when they signed up. And then the thing that really, I think, launched it was we figured out that eBay was like a great market for us, and we started doing things to proactively take off on eBay. And so in combination with the bonuses, just made it explode. Yammer took consumer virality for the first time and applied it to enterprise. So I'm always looking for something like that, and I always encourage founders to think about, what is your special distribution trick?
So when PayPal did the $10 referral trick, was it one of the first companies that had tried something like that, essentially giving free money to get more?
Pretty much. I mean, other people had done it too, but the difference was that PayPal actually had an account where you could send the money to somebody else. So I think there were a bunch of companies that basically just gave away all their venture money and died. This was like back in '99. People did crazy things like that. For PayPal, it somehow worked, I think, because the money actually got deposited in your PayPal account, and people actually then used the account and realized it had value. But there's no question it just turbocharged the virality. It was already going viral on eBay because eBay was kind of a tight ecosystem where a lot of the eBay buyers were also eBay sellers, and everyone saw each other using it, and so it exploded. And then the fact that we were paying people on top of it just made the thing hockey stick.
So for Yammer, when you have a new distribution trick where you're saying, okay, I'm not going to do the traditional on-prem box deployments, then often there will be skepticism, and possibly rightly so, because as you said, the companies are very used to a certain way of deploying. How did you deal with deploying something completely, like a very different distribution trick, which you probably face a lot of skepticism towards?
A Yammer?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's funny, when we first launched this idea that employees just start using the product and then we would sell it to your like overlords later. People criticize, like a lot of people criticized it. They called it blackmail. Like the business model was blackmail, and I think today, like no one really makes that case. I think this is like a pretty like typical thing that SaaS products will let employees use them. Maybe the employee doesn't have to pay, but they would sell like an administrative controls or a dashboard to the enterprise. A lot of products have done that, but at the time it was very new, and yeah, a lot of people sort of thought it was blackmail, but it worked, you know, and so eventually the arguments went away.
So you just were like, I'm going to do it no matter what, and then see what happens.
It was, I mean, like I said, I mean, I thought it was, yes, I mean, like it was very deliberate that I knew a corporate social network, the idea of applying a social network inside of the enterprise would be something very useful. I thought, you know, like a social intranet. I thought social networking was a new form of communication, not just media, but like actually people communicating, and that I thought it would be very useful inside companies. But that wasn't sufficient. That's merely just kind of like a good idea. But for me, what separates a good idea from something that actually can like take off is a product hook and a distribution trick. And so the distribution trick for me again was using consumer viral techniques, which, you know, might have been burned out on the consumer side, but had not yet been tried in the enterprise. And then this idea of a product hook, just starting with a real simple idea of a status update and a feed, and then building everything else around that. And so that's how I think about like game plans for a startup. And you know, I talked to a lot of founders, and they've got a good idea, but they haven't thought about. I guess what I'm looking for are sharp wedges. You know, I'm looking for sharp wedges into markets, and a product hook is kind of an example of like a product wedge. Like, what's the feature that's your like trump feature? So, meaning the thing, because at the beginning, a startup, you're not going to have the most robust product. You're not going to have the product with the most features. So the question is, what's that one feature, that one critical feature that's going to kind of launch you? And so I'll give you another example. So Box, like in the early days, what really made Box take off was mobile. So I can kind of tell you, like, I know a little bit about their sales motion. In the early days was they call up companies and say, hey, do you need, you know, cloud storage? And the company would say, no, like I already have SharePoint and, you know, this on-prem thing. And by the way, cloud sounds really scary. Okay, so that didn't work at all. Then mobile comes along, and the call to companies was much different. It was, hey, do you have an iPad initiative? And the company would say, yeah, why? You know, why are you asking? And say, well, how do you get your documents on your iPad? And you know, the prospect would say, I don't know. We don't really have a good way of doing that. SharePoint doesn't, you know, Microsoft doesn't serve like iOS. And Box would say, well, that's what we do. And so that's an example of like a wedge. Like, stop making it about like everything you're doing and figure out like what is the one thing that's going to allow you to kind of get into the market, like, you know, kind of, you know, knife your way into to create velocity behind what you're doing. And the same thing on the distribution side. Like, what is that sort of distribution technique that's going to allow you to kind of more sharply enter the market? Because the one reason startups fail is they never get traction. It's kind of obvious, right? So the question is, how do you get traction? How do you get traction fast enough with enough velocity that you can actually like make something happen on like a venture time frame? You know, like venture capital is about creating unicorns. To create, you know, billions of dollars in market cap in 5 to 10 years is an insanely hard thing to do. How do you do that? The only way you can do it is if you attack the market, I think, with wedges that allow you to just kind of get in there. So those are the kinds of things you have to ask yourself. What is your product wedge? What is your distribution wedge?
And so in the case of Box, how do you think that they define that product wedge to not be just typical, like, hey, do you need storage?
They figured out like what was the one feature. So the kind of this idea, like, do you need cloud storage? Like that type of like qualifying question to a prospect is just kind of hopelessly vague. And what they did was zero in on like where there was a gap in the marketplace in terms of what the existing products were serving, and where there was also kind of an acute need. And so they were able to figure out like, oh, okay, it's basically being able to get documents on your devices. Like for whatever reason, the existing players are not serving that. And so let's make it about that. Salesforce, I've talked, my head of sales at my chief revenue officer at Yammer had come from Salesforce. He had been there in the very early years. He's one of the early reps, been there for like almost 10 years. What he told me about is in the early days, Salesforce, they were competing against Siebel. And you got to remember, like, Siebel was like the market leader. It had this giant suite, lots of functionality. And along came, little Salesforce with this cloud product that just didn't do very much. And, so he would go in there to sell the product, and the prospect would say, well, why should I use you? Like, Siebel does everything, or they have all these features. And so what Obran, my sales guy, would say to them was, yeah, but can you generate a pipeline report to the VP of sales? And this is the problem, is that, Siebel was so complicated, it required all this like on-premise installation, that at the end of the day, like the VP of sales just wanted a pipeline report. You want to be able to generate it immediately without going through an IT person. And so he just figured out that was the one feature that trumped everything else. And so it's so incredibly important, I think, for a startup to figure that out, because product suites are like an established company game. They're like a big company game, right? Having the most comprehensive, you're never going to win on comprehensiveness as a startup, right? You've got to win on being the best at some narrowly defined thing. Now, you can have the ambition, like Box is not just for devices, it really is now more comprehensive, and same with Dropbox, right? And they've evangelized for the cloud, but you need to figure out like what is that like initial use case that is gonna make you stand out, that you can kind of use to, wedge, get into the market with velocity.
So on a related note, you had tweeted saying a good heuristic for creating a SaaS startup is to find a commonly used spreadsheet like a cap table and then turn that into a dashboard like Carta. So where else have you seen this? And also, why did you think that was a good way to think about SaaS software?
Well, what provoked this thought was I saw that Carta raised a big round, and we're users of it. It's a great product. And I remember like 5 years ago, like all the cap tables, and I've seen a lot of them, in my time, they're all these like really complicated Excel spreadsheets, and stuff is always getting like, there's always like mistakes. And, it's being managed by lawyers like charging $500 an hour. And, but it was always just a spreadsheet. And then Carta comes along and just moves the spreadsheet into like a SaaS dashboard. And all the changes that you would need to make, like add a new company or whatever, they turn into workflows. So and you would be able to then invite people and create roles and all that kind of stuff. So they would just take the spreadsheet, turn it into a dashboard, and then create workflows around it. And I was like, I wonder how many other spreadsheets this could be done for. I don't have any ideas off the top of my head. Maybe you guys do. But it seems to me that a spreadsheet is really, at this point, just the long tail of SaaS dashboards that have not been created yet. And if there is a common, if a lot of companies are using the same spreadsheet, eventually it should just be turned into a piece of like software, a SaaS product.
So where do you think is the defensibility? So you create Carta, and then 2 years down the line, I'll say that, okay, I'm going to create a cheaper Carta. What would be the true defensibility for a system of record, essentially?
There's a lot of subtle ones that get created over time. In the case of Carta, I can tell you, there was this moment where, as an angel investor, it just felt like my whole portfolio was tipping, because every week I would get an invite from Carta to pick up my, to join and get my stock certificate. I don't want to be in 5 different Cartas. I want my like portfolio companies just to use one, so I can have one account. It makes life really simple for me. So there is this sense that, SaaS categories tend to emerge on a standard. It just makes life easier for everybody. Also, whoever the market leader is in a SaaS category can spend more money on sales and marketing. And so what happens is you get a flywheel going, where the number one player in a category has the most resources, whether it's revenue or VC money, and they can now spend the most in acquisition. And so they just keep getting bigger and bigger, and eventually they dominate the category, and then they can open up APIs and kind of create, because of the need to integrate all these SaaS platforms with each other, you do get kind of like platform network effects and things like that. And so dominant SaaS platforms tend to be a lot stickier than you might think. And we tend to, only want to invest in the number one player in any SaaS category because of that dynamic.
Cool. So you had mentioned that when you were deciding on whether you want to sell Yammer, you talked to Peter Thiel, and then he asked you, are you a monopoly or are you a commodity? And you said neither. And how do you think, and that's actually true, like you're never going to be just one, or it's often not clear, then how are you going to, how did you decide then, and what are the factors in your framework for making that decision? Right.
So yeah, it's interesting. So so this is, I think everyone kind of knows Peter's startup philosophy now because he's written it in 0 to 1. But Peter's view is basically there's two kinds of startups. There's monopolies and commodities. And you want to be the monopolies. The monopolies are the ones that become, giant unicorn companies. And then the commodities kind of just, their pricing power erodes and eventually they kind of like go away. And so he thinks the job of founders is to create monopolies and the job of investors is to invest in monopolies. It's like very simple sort of clarifying theory. And then, he goes through this quite a bit in 0 to 1. And so in any event, we get offered a $1.2 billion acquisition offer by Microsoft. This is back in 2012. The book hadn't come out yet, but I called Peter, said, hey, I got this offer, so we had dinner. And so Peter ran me through his framework. And, so it's not like it's a binary thing. I mean, the company only had about 3.5 years of operating history. I mean, that's how new it still was. And we got this offer. And so we sort of ran down, well, here are the factors that point to potentially being like a monopoly long-term. And so the corollary to Peter's theory is if you're creating a monopoly, you never sell it. It's going to be incredibly valuable. I mean, this was like the lesson of Zuckerberg, like saying no to Yahoo was, he was on track to create this like enormous network effect business. It would have been a huge mistake to take the $1 billion acquisition offer from Yahoo. He rejected it. Obviously, Facebook's now a multi-$100 billion company. So if you're going to be a monopoly, never take the acquisition offer. And if you're getting commoditized, then you want to take it while you still have strategic value to an acquirer. And so we spent the dinner trying to figure out which one of these two things Yammer was. It was never clear because we didn't know, and that was the hard thing to figure out.
So how did you?
Well, at the end of the day, I think you got to be a little bit crazy to turn down a $1 billion acquisition offer for a company that's like 3 years old. So, I mean, that was a big part of it. And, and then, the other part of it is the deal made a lot of sense. Like Microsoft had a lot of complementary assets. Our thinking at the time was that document storage would be to enterprise social networks what photos were to Facebook and kind of the killer app. And so Microsoft, had a very powerful ecosystem with Microsoft Office and SharePoint. And so we thought it was like it was a good fit for the company. And we were worried if we didn't do this, then, how would we deal with that? And so that was kind of our thinking at the time.
If you had to make that decision today, what would be additional factors that you would consider?
Well, the only additional factor is that, 2020 hindsight, like Slack is on track to be a $15 billion company, and all they really do is kind of collaboration. And so, they've proven that a standalone, like kind of enterprise viral collaboration company can be a $15 billion company. And, Yammer had a lot of the same dynamics a few years earlier. And so, I don't second guess it though, but that would have been, the counter argument is no, this could actually get a lot bigger. So, who knows? I honestly don't spend too much time like sweating that decision though.
Yeah, I mean, $1 billion outcome is a good one. But in a similar vein, if you apply that monopoly versus commodity during acquisition to the earlier stage where it's pivot versus continue and persevere, how do you think of that and how do you advise the startups that you work with on pivot versus persevere?
It's really case by case. And, look, if you're creating the next Facebook, don't sell. Obviously, and you've got to figure it out. And what makes it hard is, these companies, the ones that take off right away and then get sought after by acquirers. I mean, Instagram, same thing. You don't have a lot of history. You don't know whether this is, going to be a durable thing or flash. You've got to just make your best judgment. So, if you think it can get a lot bigger, if you think it can be kind of a monopoly or highly defensible, then don't sell. But if you're worried that, again, that longer term, that this thing could get commoditized, meaning there could be like a lot of free versions of this thing and that would work just fine. You have to think really hard about an acquisition because you don't want to miss that moment. Because that moment is the time when, for whatever reason, what you've built has strategic value to the acquirer. It may not necessarily have value as a standalone company. And if you go that standalone company route, like you can miss this moment where actually your greatest value is to one of these established companies. And so, I don't think there's a binary answer to whether you should always, whether you should never sell or sell. I think you really have to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
So you're a VC, you started Craft, and all of Craft's GPs are founders. Can you tell us more about why you decided on that and why you have this philosophy?
Yeah, so I have two partners at Craft in the GP. It's me and a guy named Bill Lee, who is a very successful angel investor for 2 decades in Silicon Valley, who's had 2 successful exits. He created one of the first message board companies in the late 90s, sold it in 1999. It's called Remark. It was kind of like an early version of Reddit. And then in the mid-2000s, he created a social gaming incubator, which was very successful right away at creating a bunch of social mobile games. Sold that to Big Fish, which then got acquired by Churchill Downs for $900 million. And then my other partner is Jeff Floor, who is the founder and CEO of StubHub, which is online ticketing marketplace. It's like a $5 billion sub of eBay. And he basically, both Bill and Jeff, as well as myself, the common denominator is that we've all been founder CEOs. And so, I think at the end of the day, what venture is about, or the way we see it, is we're basically just angel investors who can write big checks. That's it. We give advice based on having been in those situations before as founder CEOs ourselves. And, but because we have a fund, and there's a bunch of angel investors who do that, but there's surprisingly few VCs who actually have had that experience building companies as the CEO. And, we think that's the most valuable kind of experience that a board member can bring to a founder, is just be a strategic sounding board and, and advise the founder through existential moments in the startup's life, of which we know there are many.
So Andreessen Horowitz also had the same philosophy in the beginning, and they've changed since. Why do you think that happened, and do you foresee that happening for Craft?
Well, I think AH's philosophy around this in the beginning, it worked. I mean, if you look back, I think the firm's about 10 years old, and I think they're the most prominent firm that's been created in the last decade in Silicon Valley. So I think that founder emphasis clearly worked for them, and I think they just reached a size and scale where maybe that policy was no longer possible. I don't know exactly what's in the future for Craft. I would say that this is a matter of personal preference. I think that we would prefer to keep things smaller. As the name Craft suggests, we think that venture is a craft business. It's kind of artisanal. It's just us working with founders, and we're not really sure how scalable it is, and that's okay with us. We do this because we enjoy working with founders on cool, cutting edge, technologies that can change the world, and we're not necessarily looking to become a huge firm.
Okay, one of the biggest investments of Craft was Bird, which you led the Series A at $50 million. And Bird is interesting because they were the market leader in this, they are the market leader in the scooter space, but Segways have existed for a while. Why do you think Segways, which were probably a precursor to the scooter ecosystem, why did they not really take off in the same way that scooters have?
Yeah, I mean, the Segway product just wasn't good enough. It was kind of a too soon product. I mean, classic too soon products, the user interface is too complicated and the functionality is too weak. So in other words, it's like what you get out of it is just not like enough. There's not enough return on how hard it is to use. And you can go back in time and see that kind of like in the Apple Newton or whatever, like the interface was like just way too complicated and it really didn't do very much. And so, I think like that had to change. Like if you look at kind of the new generation of scooters, the electric scooters, they're way easier to use than the Segway. They're way cheaper. And And so, and also they do a lot more in the sense that they get you from place to place much quicker, easier, all that kind of stuff. And so it was just a too soon product.
Cool. Okay, let's open it up to questions.
You say in '99 you worried you'd missed the boat.
Right.
Hindsight, obviously not.
Right.
There was maybe a resurgence when smartphones came along, and now I'm looking at this thing and wondering where the is the opportunity only in edge cases, or is that just a fallacy that entrepreneurs are going to believe till the end of time? And how would you suggest somebody looks for those edge cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody arrives in Silicon Valley believing that they've missed it. Like, oh, it's too late, like, because all you see are like the big companies that have already been created. And obviously it's harder to see the future. But I think, technology doesn't stop developing, and there'll always be new things that are very hard for us to imagine today. But in 5 or 10 years, there'll be things that, will just be transformative. And, figuring out what the future is going to look like is, it's a very hard thing. It's like kind of this, I think it's much easier to kind of look at the past. We're kind of like, I think like Camus' Man on the Train, who you're kind of riding the train, with your back sort of facing forward, and you can kind of see exactly where you've been, but you have no idea where we're going. And whether you're a founder or investor, it's like almost impossible to predict the future. It's like amazing how bad we are at it. But I do believe, I believe that the trend will continue. That there'll be new types of technology, more inventions, and the tech ecosystem just keeps getting bigger and bigger. I mean, when I got here in '99, the tech ecosystem was basically within a few miles of Stanford, and then there were some like hardware companies like south of there. There was nothing happening in San Francisco or the East Bay, and now Silicon Valley it's more like Silicon Bay, where it's spilled over into obviously San Francisco, Oakland. I mean, San Jose. I mean, it's huge now. It's so much bigger than it ever was. So I'm still optimistic about all the new things that are yet to come.
So you talked about how like if you want to invest in like the top person in a SaaS category, and that person will have an advantage in like how much they can spend on sales and marketing. But then at Yammer, you also said that you guys didn't really do the sales and marketing. So like, or I guess my question is like, were you the top person in that space? Would you rather invest in the product itself? And like, I guess does that strategy change based on what you're doing?
So I think there's two pieces of that question. So what we did at Yammer was redefine the category. So I think that's really important. So the category as it was defined when Yammer launched was Gartner had defined in one of these magic quadrants. It was called social software in the workplace, and every year they published a magic quadrant, and there were two companies that won it, IBM and Jive. Jive had been around, was a startup, but it had been around for 10 years. They were a couple of years away from their IPO. And we looked at this, and all those products were on-prem. They were not cloud products, and they were not viral, they were not freemium, they were not really based on a social networking paradigm. And we just said, like, those products are wrong, and that's not how the category should be defined. And we're going to redefine the category to be enterprise social networking. And so when Gartner came around, they were going to give us an F grade, basically, because we didn't check all these boxes that they had. And we said, no, listen, we're actually not social software in the workplace. We don't qualify for your magic quadrant. We didn't want to be in it. We didn't want to be a loser in there. And so we started evangelizing for this idea of enterprise social networking. And within a few years, the category came to be called, Salesforce, the next year did a whole enterprise social thing at Dreamforce. And pretty soon the category sort of became redefined as enterprise social networking. And so I do think it's possible to do that, where there's a bunch of people who are kind of existing players who are just doing it wrong. But I think it's very important for you to redefine the category if you're going to do that, and to evangelize for that redefinition. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess the next question would be like, if you were to start another company where you are redefining a category, like right. How would you approach that, I guess?
I think my tweets and like blogs still exist from back in those days. I mean, I don't think I've deleted anything. I was, as the founder CEO of Yammer, I was really out there evangelizing for this idea. And, we kind of hitched our wagon to what was happening on the consumer side. That was the time when Facebook was really like taking off and going mainstream. It had kind of, at first it had launched in colleges, then high schools. Now this was finally opening up to the mainstream, and people's parents were getting on Facebook, and no one ever thought that was possible before, something like that. And so in any event, we were able to kind of bootstrap off of what was happening on the consumer side. We said, yeah, what's happening in the consumer space is only half of what's happening. There's also social happening in the enterprise, and so we made the story interesting to people who wanted to cover it, and that's basically earned media. You don't have to pay for it if you can get reporters interested in your story and what you're doing, and you just have to figure out like a frame of reference that is interesting to them, and I think that's part of why you have to define the category, is because you have to place what you're doing in a larger context to make it interesting to people.
Is there a particular stage of company that you focus on when it comes to investing?
We're early stage, so we do seed A and B. I'd say that for seed, it's not like we don't want to compete with the early stage seed fund, so it tends to be late seed. So we call it post product, pre data. So a late seed round, but we always want to see the product. A pitch to me always begins with a product demo, not a PowerPoint. So it's kind of that late seed A and B stage.
And then the second question related is are there particular categories, industries, areas that you as a fund are interested in?
Yeah, so I think the three partners at our firm tend to focus on the areas that we did ourselves as founders. So for me, whether it was PayPal or Yammer, I focused on consumer and consumerized SaaS, and those are the main things I look for at Craft. And Jeff, having done StubHub, looks for marketplaces and e-commerce. And Bill, having done gaming, messaging, and crypto in his background, looks at those areas and kind of new emerging areas. So that's kind of the starting point. And then there's like a zillion things that are kind of fall between the cracks, and we'll look at them too in a kind of idiosyncratic way as well.
And you were particularly well known for being bullish on crypto. Is that still your stance today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm bullish on it as an emerging platform. I'm a long-term believer. The issue is just we had kind of a bubble, kind of a premature hype cycle, and now we're in the trough of disillusionment. We have to kind of rebuild. So the thing I'm kind of looking for now is this real usage. Like where are the products that actually get usage? And a hype cycle occurs whenever the hype around an area like far exceeds the fundamentals of users and real usage and transactions and all that kind of stuff. And that's what happened with crypto. But I'm still a long-term believer.
Are there any theses you particularly hold true and are looking for companies or founders within the crypto universe?
In crypto, I'm looking for anything in crypto that has real users. or real transaction volume. So like that's kind of my qualifying criteria there at this point. Yeah.
You said you focus on consumer and consumerized SaaS. I'm curious, consumer is not a particularly hot place for investment right now. What do you see as interesting in that sector?
Well, I mean, Bird was a great example of a consumer play that nobody saw coming. We, as was mentioned, we led the Series A. I think Bird is an example of the era of computing we're in, which is the era of devices and sensors. And in that case, you take a scooter and pack it full of sensors, GPS connectivity, and all of a sudden you've got a new business model around transportation. And so I'm kind of interested right now in Internet of Things. What new business models can be enabled by new kinds of devices or cheap sensors, things like that. Another investment we did is called Swarm. It's a new satellite network that's a critical enabler of this trend, where they're going to have a chip the size of a quarter that you can embed in any IoT device, and it just magically connects to the internet. You don't need to find a Wi-Fi hotspot or a cell tower. So, if you're running a device in, like, say, an agricultural field or in a shipping container in the middle of the ocean, you'll be able to find connectivity. And so I think it's going to enable a whole bunch of new types of devices and sensors. So I think that's a very interesting area, but what I would tell you is that the device or sensor has to be non-obvious. And what I mean by that is, like, Amazon can't be doing it. Amazon or Google, right? So they're doing a lot of stuff in the home right now. They're connecting your microwave, they're connecting your security cameras, like, those are just taken. Like, just don't do anything that's on their, like, 1 or 2 year product roadmaps. Find some device that no one would have ever thought to make internet connected, and it just creates some random new business model. That's the kind of stuff that excites me.
I had a question. So Tricia asked earlier about the conversation with Peter when Yammer you were deciding on the acquisition. What are conversations you've had more recently with PayPal Mafia members that have been really memorable? Maybe you haven't talked about them as much.
I don't know. I don't. They're just kind of my friends, so I don't like.
The thing is, it feels like you guys have an echo chamber. So what is that echo chamber?
What do you mean by echo chamber?
It's like, it's the same set of people talking about the same set of topics for over a decade.
I'm surprised anyone still wants to listen to us, but I don't know. I mean, do you guys feel like I've said anything new today? I don't know. I hope so. As you have each new wave of technology and we see more companies, we kind of refine our themes and heuristics. And so the stuff I've told you today is stuff I believe for a while, but hopefully it's relatively new content.
No, I'm not denying it's on you. I
Yeah.
think he's just asking, like, what are the other threads of conversation aside from the stuff that we spoke?
It's all. I mean, like I said, these are just like friends that I meet with, and so it's all kind of a blur to me. It's not like it's. Yeah. So.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I still have a page of questions, so we'd definitely love to have you over in the future. And thank you for your time. Again, we're very grateful. We know you don't do too many speaking engagements, so thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.